So the third and final PowerPoint that we have for Chapter 1, Introduction to Air Power, is dirigibles and developing the airplane. This is an advancement on what we've seen earlier in scientific research. We're going to be looking at more advanced technologies, more advanced aircraft in this PowerPoint and how they developed over time from the hot air balloon and the like. So what we're going to start here first is talking about dirigibles. And in order to start talking about the dirigibles, one of the main problems of flight, we have to determine what that main problem was with the hot air balloon. And like I said at the tail end of the last PowerPoint, it was really ultimately control of the aircraft. When you wanted to go a certain direction, you were at the mercy of the winds and at the mercy of how the prevailing winds would blow and things like that. And the only thing you could control in the hot air balloon was basically your altitude, your height. Okay. So, like it says, you can control the altitude, but we're still, again, wherever the wind blows. And probably part of the issue is, like, possibly what happens here is, you get a lot of balloon rallies where you get balloons taking off. And, at this point in time, the winds weren't probably as fast as these people expected them to be. And they thought they would clear that balloon before it got up or before it lifted off the ground, and it didn't. And you have a variety of problems like this and running into various different types of things. Hence the reason it doesn't become a very popular and a very economical way of travel. It is just, like stated in the last PowerPoint, a recreational use. So when we get into a dirigible, what is a dirigible? And a dirigible is nothing more than a steerable airship. So it is still a lighter than air aircraft. It is considered lighter than air because it uses a lighter form of air to lift it up. Hot air balloon is hot air and stuff like that. So, but this one is steerable. This one has ways to control how it flows or how it flies. There are two methods of the steering. You can see the rudders right here at the back end of the dirigible, okay? And that allows you to move that vertical flap, so those red things on there will move, and the blade to the rear, and it moves to the right or the left, and it thus steers your airship. Very similar to how a boat motor will steer, or a rudder on a boat will steer a boat through the water, okay? And the other form of steering is the power source itself. And if you take a look underneath here, and you got a close up right here, but underneath and along the sides, you'll see that there are propellers or nacelles, which have engines on them. And thus, if you want to make a turn, you just speed up one side of the dirigible and slow down the other side, and you're allowed to make that turn in aid with the rudders. And it allows you to be a lot more maneuverable than just a hot air balloon. And it's still a lighter than air aircraft. So this is kind of the main ways that aircraft now, or these lighter than aircraft, become more economical for actual travel and actual movement around instead of just recreation. So this gentleman, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, is the actual kind of the creator and the inventor of the dirigible. And he was from Germany, so he's a German inventor, and that comes into play a little bit later as to his country of origin. And around 1900, he basically created the first successful rigid dirigible. What they mean by a rigid dirigible is, as a hot air balloon, as most of you know, the hot air balloon is just a canopy of fabric, of canvas, of whatever it is that you just fold up and put in a package, and then you just heat it up and it inflates. A rigid dirigible actually has a frame, and it has a body to it, and then there's actual inside containers that hold the air that needs to be the lighter than air, the helium that they use, and so it stays its shape, and they just fill up bags on the inside. In essence, is what it does. And the first rigid durable was the LZ1. Okay, and the LZ1 again, basically just like that previous page, looked very similar to that. It led to the first commercial airship. And these were known as Zeppelins, which makes sense for Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. And how they became uh, known for commercial airships, because they were very luxurious. They had a canopy that hung underneath that had seating and beds and a galley for cooking and dining and things like that in them. So they were very luxurious. They were roomy wood panel cabins. It was, and again, at this point in time, in the infancy of air travel, air flight, they're looking at trying to make this as fancy, as luxurious as possible, because they're um, catering to the more affluent people, the wealthy people. So they want to make it look as nice as they can in their ships that they have. Um, these Zeppelins didn't carry a lot of people, even though they were huge. They carried only about 20, maybe a few more passengers. As the Zeppelins got bigger, they carried more. But the first ones was only a handful of people, and had speeds of over about 40 miles an hour. So that's, when you're looking at 40 miles an hour, you're looking at the speed limit between the middle school roundabout and the high school roundabout. That's 40 miles an hour. That's what the speed is on that road. So it's not very, very fast, okay? But it's faster than getting in a ship and crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a ship, which could take weeks. This takes a matter of only days now, okay? So this is, again, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, and being the creator of the dirigible. Um, some other things about the Zeppelins that were made. Okay, he built many throughout the years. Okay, and basically from 1910 to 1914. And what you're going to find out is there's a reason why 1914 is the ending of, or is the date that is used here at the end, because a very important event happened in 1914, or a very important thing started in 1914, and that was World War One. So at the outbreak of World War One, Zeppelin travel and Zeppelin production kind of got put on the wayside, because there was a war effort going on, and things like that. And World War One, as most of you know, took place in Europe, and most of dirigible travel and stuff like that was from Europe and around the European um, countries. So that's kind of what put their limit of those 4 years of Zeppelins. But in those 4 years, they did get a lot of good things out of it. Example, Led Zeppelins flew over 100,000 miles in that time. So they traveled quite a bit of ways, and all the Zeppelins that were built totaled about over 100,000 miles of air travel. They carried about almost 35,000 passengers, just over 34,000 passengers in crew during that time too. So this has become a big standard for travel. People would travel from place to place, and a lot of it was across the ocean and getting from that point to the other, because it was, again, like I said earlier, quicker than the actual ship that it would be, and so it became very popular. And again, it cost a little bit more money, but it was for more affluent people. Okay, well, like I said, 1914 starts World War One, so that takes place. So after World War One, they have a couple issues, and we're going to go back to um, note Ferdinand von Zeppelin's country of heritage. His country is Germany. Well, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to surrender all of their Zeppelins to the Allied forces. Okay, which means that any Zeppelin that was made by Germany that was still in parked in storage, that was being used during the war effort, that was being made, anything like that was taken from Germany and the Central Forces and distributed among the Allied forces or the Allied countries. So, United States got some, Britain got some, France got some, so on and so forth. And so they were forced to surrender all Zeppelins to the Allies and not able to make any new Zeppelins. They were not able to make them either. So the Zeppelin production after World War One hit an all-time low of zero, basically. So, and in 1926, okay, 1926, all of a sudden it comes out to the point where, okay, the Germans now can construct Zeppelins again. So we're talking about 6, 7 years after the war ended. Now, Germany, you can start constructing your Zeppelins again and get back into the commercial industry of Zeppelin travel and air travel and things like that. Okay, so that was 1926 and then the Treaty of Versailles allowed this to happen in 1926. So after 1926, there wasn't a lot more. There were dirigibles, but again, it was being they were the German dirigibles had been distributed throughout, and so the making of dirigibles was you know, started again in Germany, and only 3 Zeppelins were built after 1926. Okay, only 3 Zeppelins were ended up building, and the first one was the LZ 127, which was the Graf Zeppelin. Graf means huge, so this is a huge dirigible, huge Zeppelin. This particular Zeppelin had 590 flights, including 144 ocean crossings. So this one was a workhorse after World War One. This one did a lot of flying. This one alone had over 1,000,000 miles on it. Okay, alone had over 1,000,000 miles, and by itself carried just over 13,000 passengers. So this particular Zeppelin was the one that basically was bringing Germany back into commercial, and this allowed that to happen. The next one that came out here is the LZ 129, the Hindenburg. You are probably familiar with the Hindenburg. This is probably the most famous Zeppelin made. Okay, and it's most famous because in May 6th, 1937, this is the Zeppelin that was going from Germany to New Jersey, and when it was landing in New Jersey, exploded in New Jersey. And one thing, and you're going to watch videos on this here. Matter of fact, after this particular slide, you're going to pause this presentation, and there's 2 videos I want you to watch. I'll explain that here in a couple minutes. But these videos that you're going to watch here are going to be about the Hindenburg and how it was destroyed and what it took place and how it took place. So that is the biggest thing about the Hindenburg and its explosion and stuff like that. So that's why it's most famous, not because it did anything for travel or anything, but because it blew up and became it was filmed and everything when it happened. The other Zeppelin that was made was the LZ 130, which is the Graf Zeppelin 2. Okay, the Graf Zeppelin 2. So another big Zeppelin, and that was made around the same time these other 2 were made. However, this one was built but never went into service because in 1939, outbreak of World War II started. So World War II starts, and now, again, just like World War One, Zeppelin production stops, Zeppelin usage stops because, again, where's World War II? um, basing most of its action in Europe, in the area where it's going to be used. So this one didn't get in any service at all. So at this point, there's going to be on your Google Classroom. There are 2 short videos. So you're going to pause the PowerPoint. You're going to watch what happened to the Hindenburg first. That's I kind of want to watch in this order. So this gives a explanation. It's a graphic explanation. Somebody did all kinds of graphics and explanation of what dirigibles looked like, how they were built, how they're put together, how they used, and then basically what kind of happened to the Hindenburg. And then the second video is Hindenburg disaster. It's real Zeppelin explosion footage. So it is actually the news footage of the Hindenburg explosion because they were filming it and stuff like that. And it's actually 1937 news video footage of the Hindenburg explosion. So yes, watch at this point. You're going to watch both the what happened to the Hindenburg and the Hindenburg disaster, the real Zeppelin explosion footage. Okay, so pause your video or pause this presentation at this point, and you can go and watch those. When you're done watching those, come back to this presentation and continue on to the presentation. So now we are going to go looking at developing the airplane. Okay, we're getting away from the lighter than air, and we're going to focus now on working with our heavier than air flight. So this is now where you're not using helium or hydrogen or hot air to fly a aircraft. You are now using the power in the aircraft itself and the steps that you're going to find out later what it is to make an airplane fly. Okay, so we're going to talk some about airplane pioneers and things like that, but we're going to start out talking about they still had to struggle with problems. We talked about the struggle with the problems that they had with the lighter than air. They have to struggle with more problems with heavier than air because they don't have the gas, the lighter than air gas, to allow them to lift off. So here's the thing. One thing is they had to develop lift. Where the gas gave it its lift, they had to create, when a heavier than aircraft, they had to create something that allowed the craft to lift off. Okay, so they had to figure out how that was going to work. They had to basically, once they got it off the ground, how were they going to keep it in the air? So they had to figure out if, however we get off the ground, can that also maintain the aircraft in the air for an extended period of time? And then once I'm in the air and I'm sustained, how am I going to control where I need to go? Hot air balloons couldn't control only by the currents of the winds and stuff like that. Dirigibles got more control. Can we use that control or those types of control in the flight of a heavier than air aircraft? So these are the 3 things that pioneers of heavier than air aircraft basically had to struggle with: is making sure they could create lift, making sure they could sustain that lift and keep that lift, and make sure that once they were in the air, that they could go where they wanted to go, and they could control the flight they wanted to have. So you're going to find out how these pioneers did it, and go through some of the pioneers of this aviation, this heavier than air aircraft. The first person we're going to talk about is Sir George Cayley. Okay, and he identified 3 very important aviation forces. Okay, and when we talk about this in the future, okay, these 3 are going to be part of those forces, and there's actually going to be a 4th one added to it at a point. But he identified the three important ones right off the bat. He identified, obviously, lift, and we've talked about lift already. It has to get off the ground, otherwise it's not an airplane. It's not a mode aircraft. It's not a mode of flight. Okay. He also identified drag. If you are going to go forward, okay, that means something is obstructing that forward motion or slowing down that forward motion. Even when if you're running on the track, okay, and you're running, you can feel that wind hit you. The wind or the air that is around you is creating drag to your body. It's like all the cars in the parking lot and things like that. The cars have drag that is created on them. That's why they're making cars as aerodynamic as possible, and that's where the terminology comes from. In the aviation industry, is aerodynamics. Is trying to keep it so that the air flows neatly around the aircraft or car or whatever it may be. The third thing that he discovered was thrust. Okay. And this is actually, again, the forward motion or forward force of that aircraft or whatever it is. Again, when you're running, your thrust is in your legs, pushing you forward down the track. Or in the car, the engine creates the thrust into the drivetrain, into the wheels, and pushes it along the road. Okay. So they have thrust in there. The other thing, the fourth, and I'm just going to tell it to you, we'll talk about it in more depth later, but I just want to show you that there are four things. The fourth thing, and I'm not even bringing it up here on the thing, is gravity. Gravity is what keeps us on the ground. Okay, it keeps us down on the ground. And so if you take a look at the three forces that are up there and the one I just told you about, and you put some famous person's rules in order, equal and opposite motion, okay, you take a look. If I have thrust, I have to have drag, and that keeps me even. Okay, if I have lift, I have to have gravity, and that keeps me even. So when you look at that, those are the four forces of flight. And Sir George Cayley came up with knowing three of them were really true, and eventually the fourth one was discovered as part of this scenario too. What also Sir George Cayley did is in 1850 he built the first full-sized manned glider. So he's working with models and he's working with stuff like that. This is the first full-sized manned glider. So somebody get in a glider and glide around with it. Okay, so that happened in 1850. So this is Sir George Cayley's contribution to heavier than air flight. Heavier than air. We get to another gentleman, uh, um, John Montgomery. Okay, and he's a professor out in California, and he starts playing around with this idea of heavier air flight. And this is around 1884. Okay, and he starts doing this glider thing, kind of picking up off of what Cayley had, and kind of doing some stuff like that. And he's figuring this glider stuff out and figuring out, okay, how does this lift thing work, and how does this thrust and this drag, and maybe gravity in there and stuff like that. Well, he created a glider that was about 440 pounds. Okay, and its wings were shaped like a seagull shape. Okay, they were seagull shaped. If you take a look, anytime you drive up to the high school and the fall of the year and stuff like that, you see all these seagulls sitting around the parking lot up there. If you ever see a seagull, take a look at their wings. They have a very unique shape to their wings. Okay, so his wings were very much like that of a seagull on there. And on his flights of his glider, he flew for 600 feet. Now, if you notice, he flew at night. Okay, he flew at night. He wasn't flying at night because he thought it was easier to fly at night, or the air was better at night, or it was cooler, or anything like that. He flew at night because, like some people are today, even if you think your neighbor's doing something weird, you're gonna kind of say so. Well, he didn't want his neighbors to think he was weird, so he went and flew at night so his neighbors didn't know what he was doing. He didn't want to be ridiculed and made fun of or anything of that nature about his flying. So he did it at night, and he flew 600 feet at night. So he did a good job. Okay. Between 1886 and 1892, he constructed thousands of experiments in flight with his gliders. okay, with gliders and stuff like that. And in 1905, he unveiled a glider uh, to 15,000 people. So finally, he says, you know what? My neighbors aren't going to think I'm goofy anymore. I'm going to bring my glider out and I'm going to show it to the world. So he brings it out and he goes to 15,000 people. And he unveiled his glider. Now, Daniel Maloney was the pilot. So John Montgomery was not the pilot. He hired somebody to pilot this glider. Okay. And this guy probably trained with John Montgomery, understanding how to use the glider, because obviously they didn't have flight schools at this time. So this guy was probably working with John Montgomery alongside of him and stuff like that. So what they did is they created this unique device. They took a hot air balloon, attached the glider to the hot air balloon, okay, and then went up to 4,000 feet. Now I don't know if Daniel Maloney was in the glider during the whole ascent to 4,000 feet, or he was in the basket and climbed out of the basket and into the glider at 4,000 feet. But either way, somehow he got in the glider, and then the hot air balloon was lifted and or lifted up in 4,000 feet and was released. And Daniel Maloney flew this glider, or glided basically, for 20 minutes. Okay, thus proving that you can sustain flight. Okay, so that was a great achievement in understanding heavier than air flight. Okay, now he still didn't figure out how to get it in the air without carrying it up with a balloon, but they got to sustain some flight. Probably had some control to it also. Okay, now on April 18th, 1906 is a day that uh, some of you may recognize in here, but it is the day of the great San Francisco earthquake. Okay, and on that day, all of John Montgomery's work was destroyed in that earthquake that destroyed a lot of San Francisco. Okay, so everything that he had worked for since 1884 was destroyed. Okay, and that was a great big setback, not for just him, but setback for heavier than air flight. Okay, setback for the aircraft industry, so to speak. Finally, on October 31st, 1911, he was able to start. Well, he probably had gotten his stuff back together and started creating flights again and started creating gliders again. But then on October 31st, 1911, he actually died in a gliding accident. Okay. So again, a mere, 5 years later, he died after, all his work was destroyed. Probably, and when you stop and think about possibly why, is because he lost all his work over all that time. Now he's trying to fast track, get his work done, get it quick, get it back in, and probably didn't take time to be as safe as he should have been, and that's probably what happened. That's my guess anyway. I can't tell, I wasn't around in 1911. So so that's John Montgomery and his trek to the heavier than air flight. As we go on, we go to a gentleman you probably may not have heard of, but he is a huge, huge name in heavier than aircraft flight. It's Otto Lilienthal, and he is such a huge name in heavier than air aircraft that he's considered the father of modern aviation. Okay, and he did most of his work, or all of his work, or most of his work with gliders. Okay, and but he had a unique twist to his gliders. He did single wing gliders, which was what most people were doing, and he did two-wing or bi-wing gliders, which looks like this right here. And yes, this guy isn't falling off the glider. That's kind of how he was hung on there. But a bi-wing, it's a two-wing glider. The concept here is two wings are better than one. I get twice the lift. I can sustain twice the lift in the air, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of was his thing, is that bi-wing airplane, okay, or glider. In 1891 to 1896, he conducted over 2,000 glides using both a single and two-winged gliders. Okay, and many of his glides were in excess of 700 feet. So he had sustained lift over a extended distance. Okay, now again with gliders, you got to keep in mind you still don't have the lift to get it off the ground. Okay, you still don't have the lift to get off the ground. More than likely with gliders, and any of these gliders here, even with John Montgomery's where he dropped it from a hot air balloon, but you're probably gliding off of the edge of a cliff or off a major hill or something like that in order to get some lift ahead of time. But there's nothing that's powering you off the ground. In 1896, he started exploring putting a motor on here and actually creating powered flight. Okay, so he was starting to look at, hey, now I can understand the concept of the gliding. I got this. Let's see what happens if we attach a motor on this thing. Okay, and he was really focused on doing it with the bi-wing design. Again, having two wings, creating twice as much lift, that probably is going to be his best chance, especially when you add the weight of a motor and you have a person on there. It's going to be a little bit heavier. You want to create more lift, so you have more wing space. Okay, so he was experimenting with putting on the bi-wing design. Well, unfortunately, he was going to test his glider one more time just to make sure it was okay to get the motor taken care of and stuff like that. And he broke his back doing that last test to prepare for his powered flight. Okay, this was literally the test prior to, popping a motor on there, getting the motor attached to it, and stuff like that. And he broke his back. The unfortunate thing about Otto Lilienthal breaking his back at that point is the back killed him. Okay, so he died the next day of the complications of a broken back. Today, it probably wouldn't. It'd probably be less chance to die, but back then, it was probably so severe that it was probably not just the broken back. There was probably other issues in the fact that he broke his back, and other things happened also. But he died, and so did powered flight with him at that point too. So again, 1896, and again, if you take a look at this, Otto Lilienthal, kind of did some overlapping with John Montgomery and things like that. So they were kind of, you're not going to see a timeline of one after the other. In most cases, you're going to see a lot of overlap. A lot of these people used each other's work or used each other's ideas. You watched what other people did, things like that. So, and we're going to continue on with another pioneer. And this gentleman's name is Octave Chanute. Okay. And Octave Chanute, it was 1896, so right around when Otto Lilienthal died in his glider accident. Okay, he was performing glider experiments, but now he was around Lake Michigan area. Okay, but he wasn't doing it himself because he was in his 60s. He wasn't going to be flying around and jumping around in an airplane in his 60s or on a glider in his 60s. So he never actually flew himself. Okay, but what he did with his pilots or glider passengers or however you want to call whatever you want to call them, um, he basically took Lilienthal's work and was improving on it. So that's what Octave Chanute did. He kind of took what Lilienthal left and then um, added his own flavor to it, added his own things to it to enhance what Lilienthal was doing and to advance again heavier in air flight. And that's basically where what he had done up to that point. Now we come to another gentleman, and you probably don't know the gentleman per se, but you may have recognized the last name of this gentleman. Okay, you probably don't know him. You don't know what he did, but you recognize the last name. This is Samuel Pierpont Langley. And if you recognize the last name, Langley, you'll recognize it maybe from Langley Air Force Base. Okay? Langley had an Air Force base obviously named after him and stuff like that because he was a big pioneer in aviation and stuff like that. What you're going to see here is to what he actually did and his biggest things, contributions to the heavier than air flight. So his goal was to take these gliders and add motors to them. That was his goal. So he was working on getting these gliders and adding power, adding motors to them. And what he first started out with, he started out with a steam powered model. Okay. Now, if you understand steam powered, that's a big, monstrous uh, device. It literally look at a steam engine train. It literally has a huge container that you have to heat up because there's water in this container, and you got to heat the water to boiling so you get the steam to flow through the piping to turn the turbine to get the engine to move. And that's basically what he had to do here, as opposed to an internal combustion engine, okay, which is what we have in the cars out in they're driving around, except for obviously the electric cars. But an internal combustion engine where no steam involved, no external water tank, no external heat, everything takes place within the motor. Okay, there's little explosions in that motor with the gasoline that keeps the motor running. So you're talking a huge, huge engine in a steam powered engine compared to a small engine, which is an internal combustion motor. But he was building steam powered model, and his steam powered model actually flew for 3/4 of a mile. The only reason it stopped was it ran out of fuel because there was no way to fuel the engine to keep the steam or keep the water hot to keep the steam going to enable it to fly any farther. Okay. So, and this was a model, so obviously it wasn't full size or anything. Nobody was flying it. It was just a model. Okay. Well, the United States government was kind of impressed with this, that he was able to get a steam powered or get a powered glider in essence. It doesn't matter what was powering it, they get a powered glider. And so the United States government said, hey, we're going to give you $50,000, but you got to make a full size version of this. Okay. We want to see a full size version that somebody can fly on or ride on or however they determined it. Okay. Okay. And like I said, the problem is that engine was extremely, extremely heavy. And the bigger you made the glider, the bigger you had to make the engine. Okay. And the bigger the engine, the heavier it got. So Langley realized this, and he was convinced that the internal combustion engine was better. Now, like I said, that's the engine that you find in the automobiles nowadays and stuff like that. The internal combustion engine, much smaller for the power it puts out, much lighter for the power it puts out. Okay. Well, in working with his power gliders and things like that, he had an assistant, and that assistant was Charles Manley. Okay. Charles Manley, very intelligent gentleman, and he created a internal combustion engine, and it was a 5-cylinder radial engine. A radial, remember, goes around in a circle. Okay, it weighed 125 pounds and produced 53 horsepower. Okay, now in order to get 53 horsepower of a steam powered engine, you're probably weighing somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 pounds, 300 pounds, something like that. Okay. This was a 5-cylinder radial engine. So cylinders mean it's pistons in there. Okay. So it had 5 of them, weighed 125 pounds. So weighed less than a typical adult man at that point in time, right? And it was 53 horsepower. Okay, so that's what Charles Manley helped in Langley's attempts to put power on his gliders. So they attached this plane or this engine to his glider, okay, and they called it the aerodrome. Okay, and the aerodrome in October 7th, 1903, as when they first got everything. They figured this is what we want. We got the engine on the glider. The glider, it's all set up, and they made a launching catapult. Because remember, we're still working on we can get sustained lift. We can do that, but we can't get the airplane off the ground with its own power yet. Okay, so what they're doing is they're doing a catapult. And so what they did is they built a barge on the Potomac River, built a catapult system on top of the barge, okay, and then put the plane on there with the motor, or the glider with the motor, whatever you want to call it, the aircraft, and they catapulted it off, much like what they catapulted off a aircraft today off an aircraft carrier, okay, and they catapulted off. Now, Manley was not only the designer of the engine, but he was also the pilot of the aircraft. And if you take a good look at this picture right here, you can kind of see maybe what you kind of can guess what the result is going to be here. But yeah, it did not fly. It basically fell right into the river. So catapulted off and just went kerplunk right in the water. So they figured, okay, we got to go figure some more things out. We're going to try a couple other things and see what we can do to make this fly. Okay. And then 2 months later, December 8th, 1903, they go back and they repeat the flight. Okay. They go back out to the Potomac. They got their catapult. They got their barge. They got everything. Manley's the pilot. They repeat the flight. They repeated the flight so well, they got the same exact results. Okay? Both flight attempts failed. And now the bad thing about it is both flight attempts were covered by the press, by the newspapers. Okay? They were covered by the newspapers. That got back, obviously, to the government, who gave Langley $50,000 to create this airplane. And the government didn't want this embarrassment, so they withdrew their support to the production of this airplane, and that's where Langley's production of the motored aircraft stopped. Is because now the money dried up. Okay, you can't go and make anything if you have no more money to do it. Some critics believe that Langley spent too much time developing an engine that would be lighter and not enough time actually how to control the aircraft, because obviously it went kerplunk. He didn't have control to make it sustain its flight. He was too worried about how am I going to power the engine or power the aircraft. So that's kind of where Langley ended up, and he didn't produce much more after that. The one thing I want to point out here is notice the dates. Okay, notice the dates: December 8th, 1903, October 7th, 1903. Those dates are very interesting dates when we get into the next few slides here. Okay, so pay attention to those dates and look for what we're coming up here. So while this is going on, Langley's doing his thing and stuff like that. There's these two guys that you've heard of, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, and they have this, bicycle company that they make bicycles. Okay, and at that point in time, they're probably experimenting with putting motors on bicycles and stuff like that too. So they're a little bit experimental, but they're bike makers. Okay, they have nothing to do with the aviation industry. They're bike makers. But they were the first to achieve success in controlled, sustained, and powered flight. Okay, so they controlled the airplane in the air, they kept it in the air, and it was powered by a motor. So these are the first two that powered a airplane in flight, okay, and controlled it. They first developed an aircraft that would fly first. Then they actually controlled flight. Okay. Then they were actually controlled. So they got an airplane they got a craft, a glider that could stay in the air. Then they learned how to control it. Then they learned how to put a motor on it and do all of it together. Okay. One of the things that they did, or the way they learned to control flight, was called wing warping. Okay, and it's bending the wings. So there's a little short 2-minute video that's going to be that I'm going to show you right here on here. It's a short 2-minute video, but it kind of talks quickly about wing warping and how it works. So we're going to get to that right here, and I'll just hit play here, and it'll talk about the wing warping.
One of the challenges that the Wright brothers had was to try and figure out how to make an airplane roll. There were a lot of people working on inventing the airplane at the same time that the Wright brothers were, and they were all trying to figure this problem out. Well, the older of the two brothers, Wilbur, had sold an inner tube at the bicycle shop, and he was playing with the box, and he was bending the box like this. And he thought to himself, gee, you know, if I can get a wing to change shape like this, I can get it to roll, because what's happening is on this end, when this side goes up, there's greater lift, so that side will go up, and this side will go down, and if I switch it, it'll go the other way. So I could get a plane to roll if I can change the shape of the wings. Now, he didn't go out and just invent the airplane. He had to do some experiments, and one of their first experiments was their kite. And Tom Crouch is going to discuss the kite with us today.
Thanks, Beth. Indeed, what we have right here is a full-scale model of the very first aircraft the Wright brothers built, and it was a kite. And as Beth explained, they began by figuring out how to control an airplane in the air in roll, pitch, and yaw. And the tough one was roll. And having come up with the notion of twisting the wings, changing the geometry of the wings, they wanted to test that idea. And they built this little kite. These things down here are the kite sticks. It has 2 lines, so you actually fly it by holding the sticks like this, and the kite's up there. If you oppose your thumbs like this, what happens is that you put a twist, a torsion, across the wing. And if you look at this wing, this is angled up more than that is, right? So which side's going to have the most lift, do you think? This side or that side? This side, absolutely. Because you've not only increased the angle, but the lift. And you can do just the same thing on the other side. And so this is how the Wright brothers, by maneuvering their kite, discovered how to control an airplane and roll.
So that was called wing warping, and that's kind of how, or that's basically how the Wright brothers flew their first airplane and flew their gliders, is by warping their wings. Okay, so by October of 1902, now keep in mind, look at these dates and remember the dates from Langley. Okay, by October 1902, they had over 1,000 successful glider flights. Okay, 1,000 successful glider flights. On December 17th, okay, what was Langley's flight? Langley's was December 8th, 9 days after Langley's unsuccessful launch of his airplane in the aerodrome. In 1903, they had the Wright Flyer, and it was the first powered flight, the very first powered flight. That flight was 12 seconds long, okay, so it wasn't that long at all, covered 120 feet. Just to give you perspective, this is a 747, okay? The wingspan of a 747 is quite a bit longer than the 120-foot distance that the Wright brothers' first aircraft flew, okay? So it flew not even the full length from wingtip to wingtip of a 747. That's the very first powered flight, okay? Now, later that day, okay, they were able to fly a lot longer. They had a 59-second flight and went 852 feet. Okay, they flew 4 times that day. Okay, and that was the last flight, 59 seconds, 852 feet. The only reason they didn't fly more is because on landing on that last flight, they broke some stuff on the airplane, and then they had to go back and fix it, and it wasn't enough. It was too much to fix for that time, so they couldn't continue on for that day. So now there's one more video after this, and it's about the Wright brothers, and it is also in your Google Classroom that you're going to watch. And I don't recall exactly how long it is, but there's another video that kind of really just talks about the Wright brothers and stuff like that. It's put on by the National Air and Space Museum, I believe it is, or the Institute of Aerospace, or something like that. And it's very good. It's an older video. This video was probably put together in the 60s or something like that, but it has some very unique things to it. A couple of unique things that it has to it. It actually has video footage of not the first flight, but of flights after the first flight of Orville and Wilbur Wright. It has footage of them working on the the plane. That has some videos of them from the side, or from the ground. It has videos actually even from on the plane in flight on it. So please watch that video and get some information from that also, because that has some very interesting stuff on it. So with that, this rounds out chapter 1, the basically the evolution of flight and how the airplane, from myth to research to coming up to the very first powered flight. And that covers all those. So these 3 PowerPoints covered all that. So with that, that ends chapter 1. We will continue with other chapters later on.